Welcome back to the Information Security Forum podcast for a conversation about the Internet of Things, which I like to think of as all I did was press the button on my smartphone. The smartphone has become an extension of our work and our personal life, and everybody expects to be able to access something with a click of a button. But what are some of the serious consequences that culture of convenience has given rise to? With 21 billion connected devices estimated to be around the world by 2020, this is surely a question all technology users should be asking. So we're back with Steve Durbin, Managing Director of the ISF. And my first question, Steve, is how exposed is our human footprint? What are the business and personal consequences of IoT devices?
Well, as you've clearly outlined, Tavia, IoT is on the increase. We're certainly seeing it pop up in all elements of the way in which we not just operate from a business standpoint, but also function at home. So our fridge, for instance, the toaster, having a chip in there that's sending information. And I think that, one of the challenges that we have from an individual standpoint is, when do we say enough is enough? When do we say, well, actually, it may be convenient to have a chip in my fridge that tells me when I've run out of milk, but do I actually need that to be communicating with Amazon so that I can get it delivered the next day, or indeed that evening before I come home from work? And so IoT, I think, has progressively moved into an environment where a lot of what we do is being done because we can, from a technology standpoint. And some would argue that a lot of IoT devices are solutions looking for problems. We're also starting to see a little bit of a backlash to IoT. If you look at smart metering, for instance, there's quite a strong resistance that's building in certain parts of the world to smart metering. Why? Typically, the sorts of reasons being cited are, security, privacy. I think more fundamentally, there is a lack of understanding as to why it might even be relevant to a homeowner to have a smart meter. What is the benefit to the homeowner? There's a mistrust that it's a government-funded initiative. What else is government looking to do? And so if we start to unpick some of those things, we begin to understand that, I think from a sort of a general population standpoint, there is still this lack of trust in that whole environment. And IoT, some would argue, particularly in that personal environment, the sorts of areas I've just been mentioning, would come under that unnecessary banner. Now, there is a counter to that, of course, and that is that IoT devices are extremely effective and efficient in terms of a whole range of different jobs that they perform. So IoT devices that exist in our cars, for instance, that are providing information on an ongoing basis back to the driver, but also perhaps to roadside assistance companies, to insurance companies, that result in a lower premium, of course, for people who are driving more responsibly than those that aren't. IoT sensors that we have across all of our critical infrastructure that are monitoring things like generators and things where perhaps from a human perspective, it's very difficult to get access. So IoT is able to do that. The challenge, I think, with the Internet of Things up until fairly recently is that there was no level of consistency across the devices out there. They were all being developed, certainly by a range of different manufacturers. They didn't have a common operating system. And so the level of management and associated security around them just wasn't there. Now we've moved to a point where we are seeing some legislation being brought in, particularly in the United States and across Europe, of course, around the way in which IoT devices need to be manufactured and produced. We're also seeing consistency in terms of some of the operating systems that are being used. That's raising the attractiveness of these things from a cybercrime standpoint. So again, you might say you can't win. The reality is that IoT is certainly here to stay.
How can ransomware hijack IoT, and what's the impact of that?
Yeah, this is an area that was raised actually in our Threat Horizon report this year. So Threat Horizon 2017 for anybody who wants to go and take a look at it. We looked at the issue of ransomware, which everybody knows is on the increase. And with the Threat Horizon, what we try to do is to anticipate a little bit more. So we look out 2 years. So Threat Horizon that we produced in 2017 is called Threat Horizon 2019, for instance. And one of the things that we anticipate is cybercriminals moving ransomware from where it is today into targeting IoT devices. Not perhaps to target the individual, but to target the manufacturer. So if you think again about where some of these more sophisticated devices are sitting, they're sitting inside us, quite literally. If you happen to have had heart surgery and that kind of thing, you may find that you've got a device that's inside you that's monitoring the way in which your heart is behaving. Certainly diabetics will have that kind of thing as well. The concept of a cyber criminal being able to do something untoward with those devices is not something that a manufacturer of those devices would ever wish to entertain. And yet that is the risk that is being run with that device. So we do see something of an opportunity from a cybercrime standpoint with ransomware being applied to IoT devices. IoT devices, as I've said, have reached another level of maturity. There are sort of common operating systems. And so it is slightly easier to target them. And I think one of the things that we're flagging up in, as I say, this most recent threat horizon report that we've produced is that manufacturers need to be aware that this is possible. They need, therefore, to increase the level of security around those devices and to consider it in their risk management programs, because we do believe that it will be the manufacturers of the devices that are targeted from a ransomware perspective rather than the individuals, because that's where the major source of income to cybercriminal will lie.
With the use of IoT, there is more use on the internet itself. So are there pressures on the internet and the internet's infrastructure itself?
Certainly, if you go back, the internet was never designed. Well, the internet wasn't designed, was it? That's part of the issue. With this kind of traffic in mind, I think that, we've all suffered from loss of signal, whether it be on a mobile phone or loss of Wi-Fi or whatever it is. And so the implications of that in terms of how we respond, I think very often we forget. We've come to accept, I think, that the internet is a utility. It's like water or electricity. You turn on the tap, you flick the switch, and you expect it to work. And so we aren't anticipating it never being there. And again, I think that one of the things that we need to just focus on is what would happen if the internet weren't there? How would we respond to that? And certainly from an ISF standpoint, this is one of the areas that we encourage our risk management professionals to look at in some detail, because every business is dependent upon the internet in some way, shape or form. That's probably one of the determining factors of your effectiveness in cyberspace. And so how do you respond to a loss of connectivity? What are the implications of that, either at the device level or at the individual person level? And playing that out from a risk management standpoint, I think is a very useful exercise.
How can technology providers ensure security is built in rather than security being something that's just tagged on to an IoT device?
Yeah, I think that we've talked in other podcasts about the notion of self-regulation and how that doesn't work. I do think that manufacturers are becoming more acutely aware of a couple of things. First, the need for these devices to have constant uptime. Secondly, I think to the attractiveness of some of these devices to attack, whether that be ransomware, as we've just been discussing, or whether it be hijacking those devices to create denial of service attacks, for instance, which again we've seen in the past few months. And so I think that manufacturers, certainly in that space, are very actively looking at how they can increase the level of security around those devices. But they have to do it in line with the amount that we're prepared to pay for those actual devices. So we're also going to get into this sort of trade-off between you can have secure, but you can't have cheap. You can have cheap, but you can't have secure. And that thing, I think, is one of the things that the manufacturers will need to address. We're also seeing legislation, of course, which is forcing them to look at security in a lot more detail in that particular space. But it's certainly, a balance that all of them are having to try to get right.
Well, this is another fascinating topic, which, whether we like it or not, is going to impact all of our lives. It's good to know that bodies such as the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology will soon release best practices for all sorts of activities, to include passwords and identity technologies. to protect data from the billions of internet-connected devices, such as those toasters and your garage and your fridge. White House Cybersecurity Coordinator Rob Joyce, as quoted in Politico, said, "We would expect industry groups to start labeling themselves as compliant, and then consumers make smart choices about what they're buying." I think we all hope that that is on the horizon. For more insights into future threats to the Internet of Things, as outlined in the ISF's Threat Horizon 2019 report, please visit securityforum.org. Thanks again, Steve.